In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, there was a woman who stood out, but not just because of her confident stride or the beauty of her smile. She was new to the area and had just recently moved into a large, beautiful house, one of the finest properties on the block. To the people who lived there, she seemed like someone who could easily blend in, but there was something more about her that they didn't yet know. She wasn't just a new neighbor. She was someone who had worked tirelessly to get where she was. This woman, who we'll call Sarah, had built her life from the ground up. She wasn't born into wealth, but she had created it herself through years of hard work, perseverance, and determination. She owned a successful business, something that had taken countless late nights and sacrifices to build. She had spent years hustling, learning, and pushing herself beyond limits she once thought impossible. Sarah was proud of what she had accomplished, not out of arrogance but out of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. The house Sarah bought was more than just a home. It was a symbol of her success. It stood tall in a quiet, mostly white neighborhood, tucked away on a beautiful street with neatly trimmed lawns and houses that all looked the same. Her neighbors, most of whom had lived there for many years, were used to a very particular way of life. They were familiar with their neighbors, their routines, and everything that seemed to be a part of their little world. And now, suddenly, there was a new face, someone who didn't fit the mold they were used to. Sarah loved her new home. It was peaceful, quiet, and offered her the escape she had long desired after a busy day. It was her sanctuary. She enjoyed spending time by the pool in the backyard, letting the warm sun wash over her after a long day of work. There in the cool water, she could relax and find peace. She didn't have to worry about anything, just letting the day's stress slip away. But there was one thing Sarah didn't expect. She didn't expect to be watched. From the moment she moved in, there was a neighbor who kept an eye on her. The neighbor was a woman who lived a few doors down. She had seen Sarah a few times around the neighborhood, walking her dog, getting her mail, and of course, swimming in her backyard pool. But the more she saw Sarah, the more she began to feel something strange stirring inside her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about Sarah's presence that made her uneasy. It wasn't just that Sarah was new to the neighborhood. No, there was something deeper, something that the neighbor didn't understand. Instead of introducing herself or getting to know Sarah, the neighbor chose to keep her distance. She watched Sarah from her own home, often peeking through her window when Sarah was out in the backyard. What the neighbor didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just another resident of the neighborhood. She wasn't someone who had simply rented a house or was just passing through. Sarah owned everything. She owned the house she lived in, and many others in the area, including the neighbor's house. But that, of course, was something Sarah wasn't planning on sharing just yet. It was a sunny afternoon when Sarah decided to spend some time by the pool. The warm weather had been a rare treat, and she couldn't resist the chance to relax in the calm of her backyard. The pool was her favorite spot, a place where she could let go of the stress that followed her through the week. She loved the way the water felt, cool and refreshing, as it helped clear her mind. She sank into the pool, enjoying the silence around her, the birds chirping in the distance, and the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. As Sarah floated in the water, she didn't notice the curious eyes of her neighbor, who was once again watching from her window. The neighbor had always been one to keep an eye on the people around her. She prided herself on knowing everything about the neighborhood and its residents. When she saw Sarah out by the pool again, something inside her stirred. She had been wondering about the new neighbor for a while now, and this time, she wasn't content just watching from afar. The feeling that something was off, though she couldn't explain it, pushed her to do something about it. The neighbor hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to take action. She had no real reason to be concerned, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After all, she had never seen Sarah interact with any of the other neighbors. She didn't know much about her, other than the fact that Sarah had only moved into the neighborhood recently. The more she thought about it, the more her mind raced with thoughts she didn't quite understand. Maybe she wasn't supposed to be here. Maybe she was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. The neighbor decided to act on her hunch. She grabbed her phone and dialed the local authorities, trying to remain calm as she explained that there was a suspicious woman in the backyard. She made sure to mention that the woman was swimming alone, as if that would somehow explain her unease. Her voice was shaky, betraying the fear she felt, though she couldn't quite put it into words. She gave the operator all the details, including the address, and ended the call with the hope that someone would come and take a look. Meanwhile, Sarah was completely unaware of what was unfolding. She had her eyes closed, enjoying the peace as she swam gracefully through the water. It was the perfect way to spend her afternoon, and she felt completely at ease in her own space. Little did she know, her neighbor had already made a decision about her, one that was based solely on assumptions and fear. By the time Sarah finished her swim and made her way back into the house, the neighbor was anxiously waiting to see if the authorities would arrive. It hadn't occurred to her that she might be overreacting. Instead, she convinced herself that her actions were justified. After all, something just didn't feel right about Sarah being there. Little did she know, the truth was far different from the story she had created in her mind. Not long after the neighbor had made her call, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon. Sarah, still unaware of what was going on, continued going about her business inside her house. She was finishing up a few tasks and enjoying the comfort of being home when she suddenly heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a delivery or someone visiting the neighbors. But then, as the car came to a stop, she heard voices outside. Curious, she walked over to the window and peeked out, only to see 2 police officers standing at her gate. Sarah felt a wave of confusion. She hadn't seen anything that would have called for the attention of law enforcement. It was supposed to be just another peaceful day. She stepped outside, walking calmly toward the officers. They noticed her almost immediately. One officer, a man with a stern expression, spoke first. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but formal. "We received a call about a possible trespasser in this area. May we ask who you are?" Sarah was taken aback by the question. "I'm Sarah," she said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I live here. This is my property." The officer looked at her for a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. He was just doing his job, but he seemed puzzled. "Are you sure? We were told someone suspicious was swimming in the backyard," he explained, referring to the call made by her neighbor. At that point, Sarah couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Swimming? Suspicious. She didn't quite understand what the officer meant. "Yes, I was swimming," she said, keeping her voice calm. "But this is my home. I own this property." The officer hesitated for a moment. He seemed to be processing the situation. It was clear that something didn't add up, but he didn't want to make any assumptions. "So you live here? You own the property?" he asked, trying to confirm what she was saying. Sarah nodded. "Yes, I do. In fact, I own all of the houses around here, including the one you're standing in front of." The officer's eyes widened for a brief moment. He had come here to investigate a possible trespassing incident, but now he was faced with something completely different. He looked over at his partner, who was standing quietly beside him, also clearly surprised by the information. Sarah stood there for a moment, letting the officer take it all in. There was no need to be upset. She understood how this might have looked from the outside, but she had nothing to hide. She had worked hard for everything she had, and now the truth about her life was coming to light in a way she hadn't expected. The officer, now fully aware of his mistake, cleared his throat and nodded. "I see. It seems there has been a misunderstanding," he said. "We apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to go about your day." Sarah smiled politely. "No harm done," she said. She could tell the officers were embarrassed, but they didn't show it. They gave her one last look and turned to leave. As they walked away, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. She had always known there would be challenges living in a neighborhood where she was different, but she hadn't expected something like this. What really stung, though, wasn't the police visit. It was the fact that her neighbor had assumed the worst of her without ever bothering to get to know her. As the police officers drove away, Sarah stood in her front yard, still processing what had just happened. It wasn't often that someone called the cops on her, especially for something as simple as swimming in her own backyard. She could feel a mix of emotions: confusion, frustration, and even a little disbelief. How had things gotten so out of hand? Why had her neighbor called the authorities in the first place? She stood there for a few more minutes, looking at the house and wondering if this was how things would be from now on. She didn't want to let the situation bother her too much, but it was hard not to. After all, she had worked so hard to get where she was. Every brick, every piece of furniture in her home was a reminder of the long hours she had spent building her business, making sacrifices, and facing challenges head-on. It wasn't just about owning property. It was about the pride she took in everything she had earned. Sarah turned and went inside, but the feeling of unease lingered. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet somehow she had ended up in a situation where she was being judged simply because of how she looked. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the sound of footsteps outside. She walked to the window and saw her neighbor standing at the edge of the driveway, looking directly at her. The neighbor had probably heard the commotion earlier, and now it seemed like she was finally coming to confront Sarah. Sarah didn't know what to expect. Was the neighbor going to apologize for calling the cops on her? Or was she going to double down on her mistake and try to defend her actions? Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened the door and stepped outside. She wanted to stay calm, to handle the situation with grace, but she couldn't deny the frustration that had been building inside her. She wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to something as important as respect. The neighbor, looking a little nervous, started to speak. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier. I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice shaky. "I've lived here for a long time, and I've always kept an eye on the neighborhood. When I saw you swimming, I thought something didn't seem right. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Sarah stood silently for a moment, letting the apology hang in the air. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she didn't think it would be this. The neighbor's words didn't feel sincere. It was clear she wasn't apologizing because she realized the harm in her actions, but more because she was trying to smooth things over after realizing she had made a mistake. "I understand that you may have been confused," Sarah said calmly, her voice even. "But I also want you to know that I'm not an outsider. I live here just like everyone else. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I deserve to be treated with respect." The neighbor shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her feet. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to judge you. I don't know. I guess I assumed things based on how you looked," she admitted, her voice softening. Sarah nodded slowly. "I think that's the problem, isn't it? You assumed. You didn't take the time to really get to know me or understand who I am. And that's something we all need to work on, not just you but everyone." The neighbor looked up at Sarah, her face filled with a mix of guilt and understanding. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm really sorry. I'll do better." Sarah didn't respond immediately. There wasn't much more to say. She had made her point, and now it was up to her neighbor to learn from this experience. Sarah gave a small nod before turning and heading back into the house, feeling a sense of quiet resolve. As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but think about how important it was for people to not jump to conclusions based on appearances. The situation had been uncomfortable, but in the end, it had opened a conversation about assumptions, respect, and the need for empathy in a community. For Sarah, that was the real victory. The conversation with her neighbor didn't leave Sarah feeling entirely satisfied. Though the neighbor had apologized, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the whole situation had been a reflection of something much deeper than just a misunderstanding. It wasn't about her swimming in her own pool. It wasn't even about the police coming to her house. It was about the assumptions people made based on how she looked. about the way she was judged before she was ever given a chance to show who she really was. But Sarah wasn't one to dwell on negativity for long. Instead, she decided to move forward, choosing to let this moment become an opportunity for growth, not just for herself, but for her community. She knew that this wouldn't be the last time she faced ignorance or misunderstandings. But each encounter, no matter how small, was a chance to make a difference. Word of the incident spread quickly around the neighborhood. Sarah didn't mind. She wasn't looking for attention or sympathy. She was simply living her life. But as more and more people heard about the police visit and the confusion that had followed, the story started to change. What had begun as a simple call about a suspicious person turned into something bigger, a conversation about assumptions, prejudice, and the dangers of judging others based on appearances. Some of Sarah's neighbors, who had previously kept to themselves, began to reach out. They came by her house, stopped her while she was out walking, and even sent messages to apologize for not standing up sooner. They expressed their regret for not having questioned their own thoughts before reacting to the situation. It was a small but meaningful gesture. One particular neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the area for decades, came over one afternoon with a basket of homemade cookies. Sarah was surprised by the visit, but welcomed it nonetheless. The older woman, who had been living in the neighborhood long before Sarah arrived, sat down with her on the porch and shared her thoughts. "I've been thinking about what happened," the neighbor said softly, "and I realize now that I've been a part of the problem. I've lived here all these years, and I've never really taken the time to get to know anyone outside of my little circle. I just assumed things about people without ever asking. I'm sorry if I made you feel unwelcome." Sarah smiled gently, appreciating the honesty. "It's not just about me," she said. "It's about all of us. We all have our biases, whether we realize it or not. What matters is that we're willing to change, to learn, and to do better." The conversation lasted for hours. They talked about race, about community, about the importance of inclusivity. Sarah wasn't looking to lecture anyone. She just wanted to create understanding. The older woman left her house that day with a new perspective, and Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. Maybe she hadn't solved all the problems in the world, but she had started a conversation. And sometimes, that was enough. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that this whole experience had given her a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman or a homeowner. She was someone who could make a difference, someone who could help bridge gaps in understanding. She knew that, with patience and kindness, she could help change the way people saw the world and themselves. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to happen overnight, but Sarah was determined to keep pushing forward. She knew that by being true to herself, by standing her ground with dignity and grace, she could help her community grow in a positive direction. As time passed, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening in her neighborhood. The atmosphere seemed to change, slowly but surely. People began to smile at her more often when they saw her out walking or running errands. There was a warmth in their greetings that hadn't been there before, and Sarah couldn't help but notice it. It was as if the event with the police had served as a wake-up call for the whole neighborhood. They began to realize that they had made assumptions about her that weren't fair, and now they were doing what they could to make things right. Sarah wasn't the kind of person who held grudges, but she knew it was important to keep the conversation going. She began to engage with her neighbors more, making an effort to reach out and have casual conversations when she saw them. Whether it was in passing while walking her dog or while gardening in her front yard, she would smile, wave, and strike up a chat. Sometimes it was about the weather. Other times, it was about the latest news in town. Little by little, she got to know people better and helped them get to know her in return. There was one neighbor, a young woman named Kate, who Sarah found herself talking to quite often. Kate had always seemed friendly but distant before, keeping to herself and her family. But after the incident with the police, Sarah noticed that Kate was now more open and engaging. One afternoon, while Sarah was sitting outside reading a book, Kate came over with a coffee in hand and joined her on the porch. "Mind if I sit?" Kate asked, her smile warm and welcoming. "Of course," Sarah replied, putting down her book. "I'd love the company." They talked for a while about small things, what had been going on in the neighborhood, how Kate's children were doing in school. But gradually the conversation turned to more personal topics. Kate admitted that she had once shared some of the same assumptions about Sarah that others had. At first, she hadn't understood why Sarah had moved into the neighborhood, thinking that someone like her didn't fit in with the rest of the residents. But after seeing the way Sarah had handled everything, after watching how she had stayed calm and dignified throughout the whole situation, Kate began to think differently. She realized that Sarah wasn't just a successful woman who had the money to buy property. She was a person just like anyone else, and she deserved the same respect. "I guess I didn't really get to know you before," Kate said, her voice sincere. "I'm sorry for making assumptions. I should have been more open-minded." Sarah smiled, touched by Kate's honesty. "It's okay. We all make assumptions, but it's important to be open to changing our perspectives. That's how we grow." Kate nodded, clearly reflecting on the truth in Sarah's words. "You're right, and I'm glad we're talking now. It's good to know you better." They spent the rest of the afternoon chatting, and Sarah couldn't help but feel hopeful. This was what she had been hoping for all along, not just an apology or a change in attitude, but a deeper understanding between neighbors. Sarah knew that change didn't always happen quickly or easily, but seeing it begin to unfold before her eyes gave her hope that things were improving. As the days went on, Sarah continued to build these small connections, taking the time to talk and listen. She knew that one conversation at a time, the neighborhood could become a better place, not just for her, but for everyone. It wasn't about pointing out what was wrong. It was about working together to make things right. As Sarah continued to connect with her neighbors, she noticed a shift that was more than just about her. The entire neighborhood seemed to be opening up to the idea of change. Conversations that had once felt superficial were now deeper and more meaningful. There was a sense of camaraderie growing, a new understanding among the residents. It was as though everyone had been given a second chance to see each other for who they truly were, not just the labels they had placed on one another. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting on her porch when a few of her neighbors, Kate included, came over to ask if she would like to attend a small community gathering they were planning. It would be an informal barbecue in the park, just a way for everyone to relax, chat, and get to know each other better. At first, Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure if the invitation was because of what had happened with the police, or if the neighbors genuinely wanted to connect with her. But Kate assured her it was just a way to bring everyone together, and Sarah appreciated the offer. "I think it would be great for all of us to spend some time together," Kate said. "You're part of the neighborhood, and we really want to make sure you feel welcome here." Feeling a little nervous but hopeful, Sarah agreed to join. The event was held in a local park, just a few blocks away from her house. When Sarah arrived, she was greeted by friendly faces and a spread of food that looked more inviting than anything she had expected. The atmosphere was casual and relaxed. People were laughing, playing games, and enjoying each other's company. At first, Sarah felt like an outsider. There were so many familiar faces from the neighborhood, and she had only recently moved in. But as the afternoon went on, she began to feel more comfortable. She was included in conversations, invited to join in games, and treated just like everyone else. People asked her about her life, about how she'd come to own her properties, and about her experiences living in the area. They genuinely wanted to know her story. By the end of the day, Sarah was surprised by how much she had enjoyed herself. It wasn't just about the food or the games. It was about the connection she had made with her neighbors. The tension that had once existed, even if unspoken, was gone. The barriers between her and the rest of the community had broken down, and for the first time since moving in, she felt like she truly belonged. As she said goodbye to everyone that evening, Sarah couldn't help but feel proud. This wasn't just about one conversation or one apology. It was about real change. It was about people choosing to see one another with an open heart and mind, without the constraints of assumptions or judgments. The following weeks were filled with more moments of connection. Whether it was meeting up for a cup of coffee or simply chatting while walking their dogs, Sarah and her neighbors were slowly but surely creating a new, more inclusive community. Sarah knew that things weren't perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead. But she also knew that the foundation had been laid for something better, something that would continue to grow as long as people were willing to listen and learn from one another. And for Sarah, that was the most important thing. She had not only found a place to live, but a place where she could make a difference, where everyone had a chance to be seen and heard. Months went by, and Sarah continued to watch the changes unfold in her neighborhood. What had started as a moment of tension and misunderstanding had blossomed into something much bigger, a genuine shift in how the community connected with one another. There was a sense of unity now, a shared understanding that despite their differences, everyone was part of the same place, the same story. The relationship between Sarah and her neighbors had grown stronger over time. She had earned their respect, not just through owning her properties, but through her kindness, her patience, and her willingness to share her story. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Every conversation, every interaction was an opportunity to break down the walls that had once separated them. And slowly, those walls began to disappear. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting in her living room when she received a phone call from one of the local community leaders. He introduced himself as someone who had been organizing events for the neighborhood for years. He explained that the local council had been following the changes in the community and had been impressed by how Sarah had handled the situation with the police and her neighbors. They had seen how she had helped spark a new sense of connection and understanding, and they wanted to recognize her efforts. Sarah was taken aback at first. She hadn't expected anything like this. Recognition was never what she had been after. She had simply wanted to make things better for herself and the people around her. But as the conversation continued, she realized that this recognition wasn't just for her. It was for the entire neighborhood, for everyone who had come together to create a more inclusive environment. A few weeks later, Sarah was invited to attend a special neighborhood meeting where she was honored for her efforts. It wasn't a big formal event, just a small gathering of neighbors who had come together to celebrate the progress they had made. Sarah was humbled by the gesture, but she made sure to remind everyone that the credit didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to all of them, the neighbors who had apologized, the ones who had opened their minds, and everyone who had been willing to grow. "It's not about me," Sarah said during her brief speech at the gathering. "It's about all of us working together. This community is what we make of it. I'm just glad to be a part of it." The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt. It was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had accomplished. Sarah had set out to create a better neighborhood for herself, but in the process, she had helped create a better place for everyone. As the evening went on, Sarah spent time talking to her neighbors, laughing and sharing stories. The bonds between them were stronger than ever. People who had once avoided each other now greeted one another with smiles, and there was a shared sense of pride in the changes they had made together. In the end, Sarah realized that the true reward wasn't the recognition or the applause. It was the way her community had transformed. They had gone from strangers and neighbors to a true community. And that, she knew, was the kind of change that mattered most. With a sense of peace and fulfillment, Sarah walked back to her home that night, knowing that she had helped to build something lasting. The story of her neighborhood wasn't one of conflict or division. It was one of understanding, growth, and the power of coming together.